Hopefully, I don't look as harried as I am right now. I'm telling you, this has been one of those mornings. So we ended up getting a new computer, and because the old one you have to shut it down 2 or 3 times. And anyway, the new computer doesn't have any USB drives on it. I don't know if you've gotten a new Apple lately, but they've got to make their money, and so they changed. So all the 101 thumb drives I have, none of them work. So then you've got that, and then we had a Passport, which was an external hard drive to try to back up the old computer to stick it on the new one. Now, if you Google that, you can find 100 YouTube videos on how to copy your data onto a hard drive, external hard drive. Not one video on how to take that data and put it on your new computer without trying to, corrupt the new computer, which I've done. So all of that is, so now I've got 2 computers on my desk, a new one that I can't use and the old one that's just as bad as ever. So I was dealing with that. Kelly and I just came back from a trip, so this morning I thought, well, I'll get up at 4:30, get in there and kind of fix everything. Well, off and on with the computer, lost the mouse, lost this, lost that. I mean, it's just been a great morning. So I have no idea what we're going to talk about. This is going to be fun. So we'll get into Daniel here, and this is just been an absolute amazing study for us. But we've looked into the background. We'll look a little bit more into that, but just for some of the discrepancies, some of the accusations against Daniel, and then we're going to move on. This is Daniel again in the critics' den. We can't get him out of the critics' den. We've had him there for a couple of weeks. He spent more time there than in the lion's den, and so here we are. We're talking about something that has been criticized about the book of Daniel. Oh, this couldn't have been written in the, before all of these kingdoms took place. This has to have been 175 BC work of the Maccabean era. This is somebody that's been pushed off. And remember, this is in the main schools of theological schools and divinity of today. This is mainstream stuff. You're an outlier if you think Daniel was written back when the Babylonian era, that 70-year exile period. So if you're thinking 536 or something like that BC, they're thinking, no, that's old school. That's just, that's somebody that's not keeping up with the times. And so they've come up with all of these criticisms about Daniel and why it couldn't have been written back then. And we've dealt with some of those, and this is another one. Some of the Aramaic portions of Daniel are spelled with a D instead of the Z. Relative pronouns, particularly, is spelled with DI, not ZI. The argument, earlier documents said to employ ZI only. So there Daniel is, he's an imposter. He's putting something off on an early work, but it's not. Well, that occurred until about 1929. And then with the Rosh Shamra, and of course this is a discovery that really has very little to do with Daniel in the overall scheme of things, but the old ancient city of Ugarit is one of those tells that they started excavating, and it took them years, and they've got all kind of clay tablets out of there. But every one of those clay tablets from Ugarit are 1500 to 1200 BC. But they're also written in Syriac, which is the same thing as Aramaic. And that's when they discover, they used a D instead of a Z as well. So now we got Daniel out of that portion of the accusation. But up into that period, that was used as solid evidence to say that you people are just kind of blindly following along. And yet, if you were really, scholars and you were real serious about it, you would put Daniel where he belongs as an imposter over there in the Maccabean era. Here's another one. We could deal with this later. We'll just deal with it up front, though. Nabonidus never had a son named Belshazzar, or Belshazzar. So when you start reading your Bible and it says Belshazzar was king, well, there was no king named Belshazzar, and there was no son of Nabonidus. He was one of the last kings. So whoever wrote Daniel was really starting to be mistaken here. You people are, slightly on the, very naive side to believe all these things that you're reading because you just don't know your history. And this would occur until 1854. J.E. Taylor, British consul in Basra. Basra used to be a lot closer to the coast now than it is. We had to fly up north a little bit to get to Basra at this point. But at this point, back in the day, in Daniel's day, then Basra, of course, was right there on the seacoast of the Arabian Sea. Now, they have found all of these kind of clay cylinders, if you will, written, and they call these time capsules because of the time that they were written and because of what it's been unearthed. But what was really interesting, probably even John Kackleman in all his education can't read what's on that tablet right there or that clay table, but this is what's on there. This is Nabonidus talking. He's made one of these cylinders, and he says, Belshazzar, my son, my firstborn son, the offspring of my heart. And they were like, well, oh, okay, hold on. So he did have a son named Belshazzar. And then we find out that he spent, this is Nabonidus, he spent all of his time outside of Babylon. So he's one of those kings that wasn't a really great leader, wasn't a great king at all. In fact, they hated him. We'll talk about that in a second. But he was into history and he was into archaeology, even as an ancient king in the Babylonian era. And so he leaves. He doesn't even like Babylon. He leaves and he's out doing excavations and doing all these digs because he's more interested in other kings, ancient kings in their libraries. This is a relief that shows Nabonidus worshiping three of his favorite gods. What's the problem there? Sin, Shamash, and then Ishtar. Well, what's the favorite god of the Babylonians? What's their number one god? Marduk. But he's not depicted doing that. They chisel him off of things. In Babylon today, they uncover things where his name has been chiseled off by the Babylonians. They hated him so much because he had turned his back. He wasn't loyal to Marduk, the god. He spent all of his time out in Arabia, and so that's why somebody had to run that kingdom, and it was his son, Belshazzar. Now, that's also interesting because when you do get to that portion in chapter 5, when we start reading about Belshazzar, he's going to do something very interesting. When Daniel tells him and interprets the writing on the wall, what does he offer Daniel? The third highest position. And that had kind of had scholars scratching their head for years. Why would he offer him the third highest position? It's because Belshazzar wasn't even in the first highest position himself. He was number 2. His dad was still alive, who was out on one of these excavations. By the way, what's the point here? I mean, I'll tell you what, we'll go through one more and then we'll round that up. So when you open your Bible and you start reading Daniel and you read this, in the 3rd year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, came Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, unto Jerusalem and besieged it. We don't get very far, do we? We get Daniel 1:1, and we already start and stop right there and go, oh, there you go. It says 3rd year of the reign of Jehoiakim, but you know, if you go to 2nd Chronicles, if you go to Jeremiah 25, if you go to some of these other places, you're going to find out that it's really the 4th year of Jehoiakim. We'll find out from the other writers of the Bible in Jerusalem that it was the 4th year of Jehoiakim that Nebuchadnezzar came to Babylon. Well, what's the problem with that? So for years, this was kind of evidence that Daniel was just a late copyist and he probably didn't do that good of a job. Well, here's the problem, and here's what we found, and this was after years of having to stand there with egg on her face, apparently. But in Babylon, and up there in this, Babylonian Chaldean era, or the area, they would not count the years the same way that the Hebrews did. So the Hebrews, as you're familiar with, because you've gone through the days of creation, you've gone through the 3 days in the tomb, you've gone through a lot of these studies, and what did you find? How did the Hebrews count succession and things? If it was the year of succession, that would have been the 1st year of the reign. So let's just say that you end up taking over as king in December of 23. Come January, the 1st of the calendar year, how would the Hebrews say that how long had you been king? Okay, you already had your 1st year. In January of 24, you would be in your 2nd year. Right? And it's the same thing with days and things like that. That's just the way the Hebrews did that. We found that out the hard way with all of these kind of dates. So we knew that. What we didn't know is the Babylonians didn't follow that at all. They would call that the year of succession. So let's say you took over kingship in January 30th of 23. Then you come up with January 1st of 24. How long have you been king? Well, they would say you had a year of success or accession, and then they would say, oh, okay, well then now you're in the first year of the reign. And that's the way it's been consistent with everything that we've discovered over that. Of course, it took us a while to discover that. And so that's why when you come to timelines like this, sometimes they don't really make sense to us because we give or take a year and we wonder why. For instance, if Jehoiakim is said to have reigned for 11 years, well, how long could he have reigned in your mind and my mind? Because, for instance, today in the United States, we don't count calendars in either way. We don't do it like the Hebrews, and we don't do it like the Chaldeans, right? If I take over as king on the 1st of June in 23, my first year ends June 1st of 24. We don't go by calendar years, do we? We go by 365 and 12 months. Well, they did not. So the timeline that you put together is here. 609, Josiah, we've talked about this. He gets killed. Jehoahaz is put on the throne. He's not the regal heir. He's the second in line. And he's put on the throne by who? The Israelites. But Necho comes back from his conquest. He's already killed Josiah. He takes a look at it and goes, nope. He takes Jehoahaz and he takes him to Egypt and he's never to return, right? But he puts Jehoiakim on the throne. And Jehoiakim will reign for about 3 years, and then he will come under the Babylonian rule of Nebuchadnezzar. Of course, you have the Battle of Carchemish. It's fought at the same year. That's when Nebuchadnezzar goes over, and he absolutely stomps out the Egyptian and the Assyrian rule, and then so starts taking over. And as he's chasing the Egyptians down south, like we said, he would come by Jerusalem and said, oh, by the way, now you work for me. You have no problem with that, right? You couldn't fight off the Egyptians. You certainly were afraid of the Assyrians. I've taken care of both of them. Do you have any issues? No. We're told that actually Jehoiakim gets in fetters, and he's been taken in fetters to be taken to Babylon, but he either A, doesn't make it, B, turns around after he's there and was let go, but somehow he's able to convince Nebuchadnezzar to keep him on the throne. We know that because the Chronicles tell us that he's on the throne for 11 years, which really could be what, 9 years and 2 months, right? But, so he does that, but for 3 years he's under he's doing his own thing until Nebuchadnezzar comes along. So he serves Nebuchadnezzar for 3 years, and then he rebels. And when he rebels, about 602 we see, why doesn't Nebuchadnezzar come in at 602 and stomp him out? Because he deploys his army 22 times in 11 years. Remember what he's taken over for. Nebuchadnezzar's taken over. The Medes and the Babylonians came together to take over the Assyrians. The Assyrian Empire is huge. And if you're like anything like all of these individuals are, when you see a new king taking over, but you're in the far reaches of the hinterlands, and it's going to take them months, maybe even a year to reach you, well, that's about the time that you're going to find yourself in rebellion, right? And maybe think, oh, this is the time we could get out into some freedom and do whatever we want to do. That happened under the Persians. Remember, Xerxes is running around putting fires out all over the place. And that's exactly what Nebuchadnezzar is doing. And so he doesn't even have time to deal with Jerusalem for a while. So he sends all these bands down there that are harassing Jehoiakim. And then, of course, God has it that he's told us Jehoiakim's going to die in a very, ignominious type death. And that's exactly what happens. He gets killed. He's thrown over the wall. He may have been killed by his own people, for all we know. But we do know he wasn't buried with the kings. He was thrown over the wall out into the night. And we said that he was going to be buried, with a donkey's burial, which meant, just left to the jackals. And that's what happens. So then Nebuchadnezzar finally makes it in there in about 597, the second carrying away, right? First one, Daniel and his friends, 606, 605-ish. We're going to say 605, and then 597 he comes in. And then he puts Jehoiachin on the throne at that point. And Jehoiakim is killed. Ezekiel is carried away in 597. Why is there an asterisk by 605, 597, and then 586? Because that's the 3 dates you're going to have on your final exam here. because that's the ones that you need to know, right? If I were to say, when did the kingdoms, separate, north and south? You're going to say, well, 931 or something like that. We're going to say, well, when was Samaria actually? There were 3 actual conquerings of the northern kingdom, but when was Samaria actually, final as a city? And that was 722, right? So every Bible student should know that. And these 3 dates right here for the 3, I don't know what's happening with my mic here. I can grab my jacket. But anyway, these 3 dates are important because you'll read that everywhere you go. And it helps you keep it in mind. That last one, 586, remember, Nebuchadnezzar has had enough. And they've been warned, and they've been warned, and Jeremiah kept warning him and warning him and warning him, and finally Nebuchadnezzar comes back, finds time to get there, and then absolutely destroys Jerusalem and the temple and burns the walls down. And then we find out later, through Ezra and Nehemiah, what happens, and of course they have to build that back up and all of the trouble that's there. All right, so that's your timeline, and then we'll get on with it. And the Lord gave Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hand with part of the vessels of the house of God, and carried them into the land of Shinar to the house of his God. And he brought the vessels into the treasure house of his God. Well, we know, like we said, Jehoiakim was bound in fetters. That was 2 Chronicles 36. We know Jeremiah 22 and 36 speaks of Jehoiakim dying, but he does reign for 11 years. So somehow Nebuchadnezzar keeps him in power for a while. Why would we use the land of Shinar? Is that current language at the time this is written? That's not current language, is it? But what it is, it's an artistic way of reaching back and showing you that this is the land of the Tower of Babel in rebellion to God. And it had always stood that way in the Bible. And so that's where we find it right now, as he refers to it as the land of Shinar. In other words, God's people, you think you're special, you think you're chosen, you think you've got all this protection, you're going away in fetters to the land of Shinar, the land of rebellious people. Here's Isaiah right here. He's talking about something this is written about, 150 years earlier. He said, they're coming and they're going to carry your sons away, and they're going to take them to be eunuchs in the palace of the king of the Babylon. Now, when did Isaiah say this? Who's he talking this to? Like in 2 Kings chapter 20. He's talking to Hezekiah, right? Why is he telling this to Hezekiah? Because Hezekiah had some visitors. These visitors are from Babylon, and they come to see how he is because the king of Babylon had heard that Hezekiah's not doing well. They send a little contingency down there, and Hezekiah's kind of proud. He's got everything going pretty well for him. He's no longer sick, and so you know how that goes. Pretty easy to forget about those things. And so now he's all proud, and he starts showing these people, this envoy, all of the beauty of Jerusalem. He shows them the temple, all the gold and the silver and everything. And Isaiah comes in and says, did you show those guys everything? Yeah, I showed them everything. You showed them all that God's things? Yeah, showed them all. That's interesting. These guys are going to come back. They're going to smash your city. They're going to take your sons. They're going to castrate them. And that's when that was written. And we see then the fulfillment. As we go through here, we're going to find out that they're going to do what every king does, and that Nebuchadnezzar is a smart guy. He's got a temper, yes, but he's also one of the greatest kings in history, probably shortchanged because he's talked about so much in the Bible in this controversial book of Daniel. But he's an amazing builder, and he does a lot of great things. He's a huge step up from the Assyrians, right? He's not going to build his empire on terror like the Assyrians did. He's going to do so much more that you would do in a leadership position. He wants those children of Israel in the palace, just like he had a lot of Greeks. You know, one of the problems and one of the critics were, Daniel used some instrumental music terms that were Greek terms. Well, the palace was filled with Greeks. There was a Greek influence already prevalent in Babylon at the time. Nebuchadnezzar's going to bring them in. He knows if he could Babylonianize them, and make them Chaldeans, that he's going to have no issues whatsoever. And that's going to sew the kingdom together and keep it tight. That's only smart. And so they're looking for the smart use. They're looking for the pretty use. They're looking for the good-looking ones and ones that are already educated, that have shown that they know the sciences, they know these things, but now they're going to be educated and nourished for 3 years. And then they're going to be coming in front of the king for an interview. They're going to change their names. And we've talked about this before. And they're just going to change those names because they want them to be pure Chaldean. They want them to change their names. They want to change the language. Speaking different tongues is not necessarily a strength, no matter what you're told today. But they want them to speak the Chaldean tongue, because that's unifying as the same language, as opposed to different languages and different cultures. And so they're going to change these names and go, no, let's forget about Jehovah God. Let's get ourselves a little bit more in line with some of these Chaldean deities. What is it that Daniel's purposing in his heart to do here? Not to defile himself with what? You can't even tell me that. Isn't that amazing? We can argue about it and we could surmise. We go, well, this was food that was offered to an idol. Well, that's a great idea. I'm not saying that's wrong at all, but you're not told that, are you? It could be that this is Levitical laws of food, that he doesn't want to defile himself with things that are unclean animals. That could be very likely the case. We're not told that. Is that the hill you would die on? Is that the sword as a castrated 14-year-old boy that's never going to marry and live with friends the rest of your life? Is that the sword you want to fall on? Are you telling me that you and I could not justify in our minds somehow in this situation? Well, we already heard from Paul, and that's kind of my thinking, like, well, if food to an idol is nothing to me, what does it matter to me? But I don't want to make the king angry. Folks, this is astounding. For us not to understand the depth of what's happening here with a young man that's been carried away and mutilated in a torturous way, and then he's standing here. What would the question that you would be asking? Jehovah God, what? He abandoned us. Jerusalem's getting sacked. We're in a foreign land. The God that I've been bowing down to and I've been trusting in, now look at me. And if things go awry, I may not make it through this. What is he thinking? To me, this is amazing that God is not even telling you what the defilement is. We spend more time trying to figure it out, but I'm telling you, it's important that we don't know. God's trying to tell you something else. It's amazing that this young man is willing to put it all on the line for something that's not even explained. But he took it as defilement. For a God that most of them thought had abandoned them. And we know that from Ezekiel. Ezekiel has to explain to them. You're here for a reason. You turned your back first. You did this, and God said this would happen. But he will bring you back. The remnant will return. And Daniel's purposing in his heart. And you know what? We've got some idea in religion today that Jesus was the life of the party, that we could go hucking it up and have fun, that our forefathers and ancestors had it all wrong, and this could just be just a wonderful, light time for us, and we could go around slapping each other on the backs, and all is well, regardless of what's happening around us. And here's a young man that's willing to stand up when it meant possibly his life for something that we don't even know what it was. And it has to be probably food to idols or Levitical. And you know what? Levitical unclean animals, that's not the only problem with the Levitical law. What's the other problem with it? Folks, he's never going to the temple again. Even if he was in Jerusalem, he wouldn't be able to attend. All of those things are gone. There's all kind of things in the Levitical law that's gone to him. And yet he's still able to do this. And it's not a vegan thing. We're going to find out in Daniel chapter 10, he was a wine drinker and a meat eater, right? Because when he goes to fast, he holds those things from himself. So this is main staple diet for them, for he is a meat eater. He does drink wine, but in this case, it's something else. It's something about it that's going to defile him. And he makes this incredible stand. Kind of like we're told in 1 Peter, well, it could be the will of God that you suffer for doing good. I don't want to hear that, do you? I don't want to hear that I have to make some kind of stand like this when I feel like I've been abandoned by God and I'm looking around wondering what happened. And I'm living in the trauma of life. And God said, I'm going to visit the iniquities of your fathers upon the second, the third, the fourth generation. But we know that doesn't mean guilt. We know from Ezekiel 18 that doesn't mean guilt. You don't pay this for the sins of your father, but what you pay the consequences of the sins of other people. We most certainly do. There's a video that just came out about somebody, a 15-year-old girl, taking another one and bashing her head in a concrete sidewalk until she was in convulsions. And then triumphantly walking around crowing about it and stepping over her body and nobody acting like it was a big deal. We pay for the sins and the bloodthirst of other people. And God doesn't take that away from his people. I'm all about praising him when things go my way, but what he's asking is, are you willing to praise him in the storm as it is? When your mind is full of questions. Daniel had to have so many questions. How is this going to end? And when you stand in a dark culture, it's not a party. You stand tall and you stand alone. And if you don't find it that way, it's because we have learned to dance. I've learned to sashay this way when my boss got this way. When my friends started talking that way, I sashayed a little bit this way. I mean, I know what it's like. You're 35,000 feet over the Atlantic and somebody starts laughing saying, this guy believed that the world was no longer, no older than 8,000 years old. I got a choice to make. I can let him know he's flying with another kook like that, or I could just be quiet. What's it got to do with me? I had an ops group commander once that was just making fun of anybody that didn't believe in evolution. It was just a foregone conclusion, and I thought, well, here's my chance. We used to debate so much that even years later he sent me, because I always said, well, where's your missing link? And he sent me a National Geographic with an ape's picture on it, kind of half man, half ape or something. But, he's kind of like the critics of Daniel. You don't have to answer everyone. You don't have to continue to answer every critic. Why? Because it's enough to find a pattern where disbelief is the predecessor of all of this skepticism. It's not the other way around. It's just like when Darwin wrote The Origin of Species. He was a skeptic and disbeliever first and then went out and built his model. Daniel is somebody to consider in our lives when things start going very dark. For it is better if the will of God should so will that we suffer for well-doing. And yet he says, now God made Daniel to find kindness and compassion in the sight of the prince of the eunuchs. Proverbs 16:7 says, when a man's ways please Jehovah, he maketh even his enemies to be at peace with him. I love that. To follow God. And he looks down in his providential care and he makes Daniel to find kindness and compassion. But what if he hadn't? Would it made a difference? It may make a difference to me, but it didn't to that young man. It didn't make a difference at all. I would say if we're not in serious conflict with the culture around us at this point, and your friends and your neighbors, it's because we've learned to dance. Daniel was no dancer. But he didn't go and look for problems either. He did it in a very noble way, in a very honorable way. And so we read as we go on, and now God made to find him the kindness and the compassion in the sight of the prince of the eunuchs. And the prince, of course, was afraid, and he's looking to try to get himself out of trouble. And Daniel says, well, give me 10 days. I don't know why I came up with 10 days, but that's a pretty short fare, isn't it? He's supposed to be examined in 3 years, and it's supposed to be after the education and the diet that he's going through. But he says, give me 10 days. And there's no doubt in my mind, I think that God reaches out at this point, and he's going to bring things in history to a point where he needs them. So they look fatter in flesh. Their countenances appear fairer. And in 17 here we find that God gave them knowledge and skill and all learning and wisdom, and Daniel had understanding in all visions and dreams. Some people say, well, Daniel's not a typical prophet. He doesn't really fulfill or fill in the office of a prophet. But, God says this is the way he did speak to people at one time, was in these divers portions and divers manners with visions and dreams. And Daniel certainly is a man after God, and he is going to be used in such an incredible, powerful way that people are still arguing about it. But it brings us to this question of miraculous. There's a lot of controversy over this. I don't know why, but when I told you last week that we are losing the fundamentals of our faith, it's basic questions like this that I think we need to keep going back and kind of wrestling with and ruminating on. The miraculous is not just God's power. That's not what we're talking about. It's a certain type of power. It was for a certain reason. Right? The purpose of the miracle is different than the providential care of God. What's the difference? One of them is long-term, to bring events around to the point where God needs them, wants them, will do for them. The miracle is immediate, and it's looking for an immediate response that has long-term effects. But the purpose of the miracle was to prove beyond a shadow of a doubt to even the disbelievers that a miracle had occurred. Matthew 12 and 24 is one of the great passages. You should have this kind of in your mind when people start talking about a miracle and what it is. The denominations throw this word around all the time. When you say, well, no, that's not a miracle, they say, well, you're putting God in a box. No, actually you are, because now you've discounted what a powerful miracle really is. You've watered that down to it probably couldn't have happened that way, but that's a miracle from God. When the disbeliever looks and goes, well, that's not miraculous at all. People that are cured of cancer after going through radiation and chemo treatment, even if they had a very 2% chance of living, if they live, that's not miraculous. The only one that we know that took any time at all was when Jesus said, "What do you see?" And he asked him that for a reason, by the way. And he said, "I see men as they're walking around like trees." And so then he heals them completely there. A reason that we probably can't explain. But other than that, there's not anything that's not instantaneous. And that these people could not deny the power of God. They're only attributing it to the power of the demons. These people hate Jesus, and they can't say, "Well, no, that didn't happen." In Acts 4:16 is the same thing. You probably should have that marked in your Bible. They drag them in, and they say, "Well, they know they've done these things, and we can't deny it." That's the miraculous, undeniable, immediate, and it's for a purpose. To show that people have the Word of God, or that Jesus was the person that he said he was. What's the difference? What's Philemon 1:15 about? What's the word perhaps there? Do you have perhaps in your translations? This is Paul, an inspired apostle, the greatest apostle that ever lived. He was able to lay his hands on other people and pass on miraculous gifts. He had perfect recollection. And yet, when it comes to the providence of God, how did he define it? Well, God did this. God did that. I know he did. No, he defined it by saying, perhaps. Why? Because those things could have happened in a natural course of events anyway, according to our feeble, short-sighted minds. Providence of God is defined by the word perhaps. And don't tell me it's less of a power of God, that somehow God doesn't have the same power and we're putting him in a box because we don't believe in miracles. Miracles is a special kind. If you were to ask me, in my human opinion, I would say providential care over the world in long term is a lot more difficult for God than a miracle would have been. We put God in a box when we think he can't touch this world, but in a miraculous way. And if we're arguing about whether something is a miracle or not, by definition, it's already not. And I don't care if you can come out of the denominations and jump up and down, their belief that something is a miracle doesn't make it so, because if you talk to them, they're going to say, "Oh no, I know it's the power of God. I know it's the power of God. I know it's a miracle. Yeah, praise the Lord. It's a miracle." I don't care how excited you get. That doesn't change anything about what happened, and it doesn't cause it to be a miracle. The unbeliever will tell you whether it's a miracle or not. Not those who are jumping up and down saying it's a miracle from God. I talked to John and Catherine in some very interesting discussion we had. It made me rethink some things about providence, but I will say this. If God reaches into the affairs of men with his finger and touches those affairs so that it comes out in a certain thing, we don't know how he did that. To say it's not supernatural or supernatural, some people would get caught up and go, "Yeah, but miracles have ceased, so it wasn't this way or that way." I would just say, look, that's just the wrong discussion, because we don't know. We just know he touched the events so that they come out his way to take care of his people, perhaps. But we don't know how he touched the events. But in a miracle, we do. He makes it very plain. That's the whole thing. The miracle is, by definition, is he's going to show you that it was his power. It was immediate. And we're told in several cases that, or in several places in the Bible, that those things have ceased. And why? Well, we obviously know we don't see them today. Even the first and second century, the second century writers were already talking that they had ceased, because it was just obvious. But go back, what's the purpose of a miracle? In other words, if somebody comes up to you and says, "Well, I know this preacher performs miracles," and say, "Well, what's his new revelation?" Because the Holy Spirit worked in that way. It was what? Inspiration and revelation and confirmation of that revelation, period. That's what the miracles were. Confirmation of the revelation, period. You don't have revelation, then don't give me your miracle. You're not doing anything. You're not proving anything. And it certainly isn't about growing somebody's leg longer or getting rid of headaches. It's about people that were born blind or that were lame for their whole life, that everybody knew. And they didn't get up and they didn't get on a walker and they didn't go teetering around the auditorium just to go back to physical therapy. They got up leaping and running. Miracles have ceased, but God's power has not, and his providential care has not, and it's a totally different realm. But that's the basics and fundamentals of the faith, and we can't go around talking about things like we're Joel Osteen on television. We need to get back to the Bible and how the Bible defines things. And if I can't define a miracle to you, and I bet you can't define it adequately for me, at least to satisfy me, we can explain it in its representation, what it is, how it works, who saw it, who could not deny it. And then we're told those miracles, those signs have ceased. And everything else is perhaps. And we say perhaps on the details. Do we know overall that God is going to bring the culmination of history to where he wants it? Yes. But how he does that, when he does that, who's in power, who's taking over, perhaps. Perhaps. We don't know. We don't know the details. And that's the difference. In Daniel chapter 2, as we go through, we're going to find out that Daniel and his companions are going to be able to shine and stand up and begin to start a relationship with the most powerful man in the earth. Nebuchadnezzar is a very religious man, and it's going to be a very special kind of relationship that Daniel, even though a prisoner of sorts, is going to end up with this relationship. And he's going to be able to show the God of heaven, and he's going to have a conversion of this very paganistic, idolatrous king. Thanks a lot so much for your time, kind attention. So John has said it shows that Daniel was continuous in this purposing in his heart. It's just not one event. And it's also that he doesn't know the end. In other words, it's not about whether or not God's going to take care of me. He purposes in his heart first, and then we see God being able with his providential care to care for Daniel. He's not looking like Gideon for a sign from God, then says, okay, I'll do it your way. From the very beginning, he just purposes in his heart to follow Jehovah God. Good point.